All right. Hello and a warm welcome, everyone. My name is Miles Toast, and I have the honor to represent the bright minds of the CDPR level design team here at GDC today. I've been working as a level designer at CDPR for more than 10 years now, and currently have the privilege to lead the level design team on our upcoming Witcher game. Small disclaimer, the timing of this talk will actually be pretty tight, which is why, unfortunately, I believe there won't be any time for Q&A here in this room. However, after the talk, I will wander straight outside. There's this little alcove, and there I will gladly answer all of your questions until I drop. So, once again, I'm so happy to see you all here and would like to thank you from the bottom of my heart for joining me. Today, I would like to tell you a 5-part story about how the CDPR level design team and I learned of the benefits of missing out. My hope with this talk is that I can provide you guys with some insights into the level design of Cyberpunk 2077, and in the end, a better understanding and a concrete set of principles of how to create non-linear levels that give each player, no matter which path they pick, a more special experience. And our journey starts right at the beginning. It's shortly before the release of our second Witcher 3 expansion, Blood and Wine, in early 2016, when I, together with the other level designers, start moving to Cyberpunk 2077. After 4 years of working on a medieval fantasy world with wide open landscapes, relatively limited amount of ways to play a defined character, no offense Geralt, and a third-person perspective, I couldn't wait to switch working on a game that I learned couldn't be more different in regards to the challenges it would present. I was hyped. So, what were we about to deal with? Cyberpunk 2077 takes place entirely in first-person perspective in a claustrophobic megalopolis called Night City. Unlike predefined Witcher Geralt, V, our protagonist, was meant to allow players the ultimate freedom to play who they want to be. That is, if we could pull it off. No pressure. From a high level, all of our recent AAA RPGs are based on a few pillars. That is, the freedom in the story, freedom in the world, freedom in the gameplay. When we look at these design pillars, it's actually the first two which have been massive in driving the development of Witcher 3. It's the third one, then, freedom in gameplay, that was the big new addition to Cyberpunk. And this is where the gameplay and level design teams wanted to make a gigantic leap forward. The inspiration for our ambitions came from immersive sim titans, such as the original Deus Ex. Mind you, it being CDPR, we weren't the only discipline with huge ambitions and dreams. So, based off these pillars, we were presented by our directors with a few design goals. Style over substance is a motto that is at the heart of Mike Pondsmith's original pen and paper universe, which Cyberpunk actually is based on. Why do something in a mundane way when you could do and go about it in style? Our goal was to give players the options to generously apply the rule of cool to their characters and how they play them. Likewise, we didn't want them to go do that and then end up in a dead end or with an unviable playstyle. So every option they chose, no matter the combo, should result in a valid way to play the game. This is what freedom in gameplay was all about, after all. And in order to enable this level of freedom, we were asked to make levels that supported a ton of vastly different playstyles. That is melee versus ranged, mobility versus stability, brute force versus ingenuity, and combat versus stealth. And we thought to ourselves, levels supported by immersive sim-style systems and built as sandboxes. What a dream. And they all had to be part of a huge open world and take into account the complex branching narrative and cinematic focus of our quests with all their possibilities and outcomes. Oh. Now, Neither the studio nor most of the 4 to 5 level designers working on the game at the time had ever done stuff like this before. That includes myself. But as insane as it sounded, it also sounded fucking awesome. And boy, were we up to the challenge. So, how does one even begin to eat this whale? This is a question for which it took us a long time to find an answer to. Our gameplay designers decided to base all of the abilities and perks on the fantasies of the classes of the original pen and paper. We didn't want to have fixed classes in Cyberpunk 2077, freedom and all that, but instead allow players to build their own by mixing and matching a ton of different perks, abilities, weapons, and cyberware to effectively recreate the fantasy of the source game's classes, or anything in between. Knowing this, we decided to structure our levels around the most purest character fantasies Cyberpunk players would be able to create. Our archetypes, representing the original classes, Solo, Netrunner, and Techie. The theory was that if a player completely invested themselves into fulfilling a specific archetype, they would get their own unique path through a level, and that would feel rewarding. If players were mixing archetypes, they would be able to follow one of the 3 paths for as long as they liked, and if their abilities were not high enough, they simply found a more interesting way to traverse the level, they could simply switch to another path. However, what if they followed a path, then got stuck, for whatever reason, without the necessary abilities to successfully switch to any other playstyle path? So to avoid such situations, we also added a failsafe. That is the generic path, which was free from any skill checks. The generic path would be our fallback to ensure players could always progress down the critical path. This was super important to us because we pride ourselves on being storytellers, and we did not want a lack of a player's foresight to get in the way of them experiencing our narrative. And to encourage better use of playstyles, we also decided that the generic path should always be the most difficult one. Now, this would often end up clashing with our storytelling requirements because it's often easiest to construct a great narrative around the one path that all players can pass, no matter how they build their character. And as a result of the generic path being the most difficult one, conversely, playstyle paths would provide the least resistance, contributing to the power fantasy they should provide to players. And this is how that would look like on an actual level. This is a gig location I had the opportunity to create the base blockout for early in the game's development. And because of that, it reflects our initial design assumptions really well. And you can think of a gig as a relatively brief type of handcrafted open world mission. First off, the generic stealth and combat path. Here, they actually coincide, with stealth mostly being focused on waiting for opportune timing windows to bypass enemy patrols. Using double jump, the Solo can infiltrate the area through an alternative entrance and smoothly reach the goal. It's probably hard to see on these, but it is what it is. The Netrunner can hack devices and manipulate enemies to create distractions, to create their own timing windows. Back then, we used hackable devices like a trail of breadcrumbs to lead the Netrunner's way. And finally, the Techie, who could break in and use a completely different route altogether. Techies initially had their own custom mechanic planned, but in practice, it played too closely to the Netrunner's playstyle. And in the end, we couldn't really find and afford a meaningful difference between these two playstyles, which led to the Techie being downscoped in importance to a more supporting playstyle as opposed to his own full archetype. I also had the pleasure to be part of content team number 2. And my team members were incredible without exception, and together we were responsible for bringing the Judy questline to life. This is an example from the final game of our Playstyles in Action on one of my locations, which we internally refer to as the Braindance Studio. As a level designer, I was responsible for both the design and implementation of the location itself, as well as the implementation of the encounters. Can you bring the volume back up, please?
Get your ass moving. It's my break. All right, enough slacking around. Get that shit off the street. If you're in such a hurry, you do it.
Night City, expect the unexpected.
What?
Got the blueprint. Be there in a sec.
And here is actually the Braindance Studio played in a completely different way. While designing and implementing encounters such as these, we constantly had to balance the different playstyles and adjust our scripting to make sure all possibilities were playing in concert with each other.
You get everything inside.
Heard shot. You still alive?
I'm here. Got no time to creep around.
She's mine!
What? Where?
Got the blueprint. Be there in a sec. Try to find a way to the
Don't
lower
rush
level.
me.
Now, NPC behavior would need to adjust to a sudden combat situation, which in theory, as you can see, could occur at any time and at any moment of an encounter like this. While our AI is able to handle a wide variety of situations reasonably well thanks to our great work of our gameplay designers and programmers, in order to make sure our combat always felt right, enemies would, for example, need to position themselves towards where we wanted the player to go relative to the player's position. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that we often had to script not just the stealth sequences, but also multiple combat scenarios. All right, so that didn't look so bad. I actually recall once walking past one of our testers using our bullet time ability, Sandevistan, very much a combat skill, to bypass patrols while stealthing. Another time, I saw a really good friend of mine force his way into a building for which he did not have the proper techie skill by punching a hole into a window with his bare fists over the course of a whole minute. Things looked really promising. So let's ship it. No, the joke is about to come. Sean, don't laugh yet. Now, the launch of Cyberpunk 2077 was really rough. I'm sure many of you in here can relate to me when I say that making games such as Cyberpunk 2077 is truly a dream come true, at least for me. And I'm proud to always give it my all to help do my part in realizing the wonderfully ambitious and demanding projects we work on at CDPR. Pouring your heart into a project and then having it cause so much disappointment despite your best efforts is crushing. And my heart goes out to all the devs who have gone through similar experiences. But you trip, you get back up. In 2013, I started out in an environment where we wanted to prove that this small Polish developer could redefine open-world RPGs. And as a team, we were now back to wanting to prove that we're serious about learning from our mistakes and doing better. It took us a few patches to finally gain some insight into how fruitful our efforts from level design perspective actually were. And overall, it was pretty decent. Players were happy to experiment with their playstyles. We even added a respec mechanic post-launch to help them experiment even more. And also, the balance between validity of playstyles was also pretty good. So there was no, like dominant playstyle over the other. Everyone was happy playing just what they wanted to play. And of course, We saw people play in ways we had not anticipated. To me, using throwing knives or silenced pistols to distract enemies was one of these examples. However, highly ambitious as we were, we couldn't help but notice some criticism that kept coming up. One was that players didn't really feel like whatever playstyle they picked mattered that much. The experience wouldn't actually drastically change. And I have a suspicion that sentiment may have gotten even worse after we added that simple respec mechanic. Now, it turns out, though, that on closer inspection, this problem was pretty complex, and LD was only one part of the equation. We also would need to evaluate how our perk system would itself and even our own design mentality affected the problem. That is, when it comes to encounters on quests, we basically were trying to create multiple, highly polished linear experiences as opposed to interwoven ones where it's up to the player how much they experience. If there was a cool or important thing along the path, we really didn't want the player to suffer a diminished experience because they missed it. Also, you guys should have seen my Twitter inbox. Some of them creatively compared our work to having combined noodles and raisins. And waking up to that on launch day was truly something. Jokes aside, though, the positive outlook here is that despite it all, people really cared about the quality of our work. And now it was on us to show them that we did too. All right. So, learning from mistakes and doing better. Becoming better starts with understanding one's own shortcomings. And in spring 2022, our level design team set itself a mission. We wanted to evaluate what we could reasonably fix in patches or what we may want to look at to do better in the future. And on that note, I know the Project Orion team is hiring for our Boston studio, and you can find our devs here running around, so if you're interested in that, feel free to catch them. Okay, to figure out what we level designers should do, the team internally kicked off a research and development project. Every LD would try to find one level design related problem in Cyberpunk 2077, analyze it, propose a solution, and present that to the team for further discussion. And so, I embarked on a new mission. The problem I wanted to research was the following. Level design in Cyberpunk 2077 is focused on supporting various playstyles by providing branching, often non-linear designs. Yet, since launch, we have learned that players don't feel like playstyles and perks they commit to matter much. Other games feature less varied perks, less options, and yet those games seem to have succeeded where we have not. My mission objectives then were the following. First, I wanted to gain insight into how our level design contributes negatively to the feeling of playstyles not mattering. And then, I wanted to use that information to improve future designs to enhance the feeling of playstyles mattering and being fun. So with the problem and my mission clearly stated, it was time to come up with a plan. My initial hunch was to go back to the formula, and with the wisdom of hindsight, revisit and analyze the games that inspired us in the first place. These were games such as Arcane's Dishonored 1 and 2, Rocksteady's Batman Arkham series, and of course Iron Storm's original Deus Ex, as well as Eidos' follow-ups, and many more. Now then, I wanted to dissect our work more closely in hopes of finding out the differences that may contribute to our problem. My hope was that I could then formulate a set of principles based on what I would find, which we could use to improve our future work. And to further validate these principles, I wanted to apply them theoretically, simply to see what would happen. So since I'm in love with the games that I mentioned before, it would be easy for me to get excited and simply go, all right, guys, we just need to build levels exactly like these guys do. And knowing myself, I decided to do a little reality check after replaying them. First off, we put our narrative first. It's our trademark, and everything we do is meant to contribute to telling a great story in an open world that feels real and affords the player many freedoms. With, for example, no loading screens, which meant that building exteriors and interiors always had to match. Secondly, because of the size of our worlds, we need to make a ton of content. Cyberpunk 2077 features more than 85 gigs, almost 40 main missions, and more than 25 side missions, most of which feature one or multiple bespoke custom locations. And thirdly, because of these first 2 points, we can always brute force a solution by simply providing completely different paths which individually would compare to a single level in our game. So, that meant whatever principles I wanted to form should consider our production reality, and thus be broken down enough so that we could apply them even on a smaller scale. And now, if this seems like a relatively well put together plan, the reality is that I had no clue what I was going to find or if any of this would result in anything meaningful. But onward we march. And I found 2 major issues that kept repeating throughout our levels. It's not like all of them were affected by both of these issues in the same way, but it's happened often enough that on closer inspection, it was definitely noticeable. To make sure the generic path was a reliable fallback, we often made it super obvious, and this resulted in us inadvertently streamlining the experience to the point where, yes, the generic path was the fallback, but it also became the most obvious one. Why pick a playstyle path when the generic solution is so close, easy to reach, and obvious? Certainly, our guidance systems with paths to objectives being displayed on the minimap also didn't do us many favors here. The other issue I kept finding was related to how we seed cool optional content. If you take a look at Dishonored 2, for example, and here, shout out to the team over at Arcane, we're big fans of your work, we see that as soon as the player actually moves from the golden path, they are bound to run into some cool things. This is a cool way to reward players with unique experience, but it also means that depending on which path you pick and what you find there, the information the player has about the world can be slightly different. In an effort to make sure that players would experience the best possible narrative, we often would put the coolest and most important things following the generic path, because this way we could make sure all players would be able to experience it. This becomes especially obvious and problematic when we look at the way we would utilize skill checks. For this, we'll look at a somewhat extreme example, but it is in the game. In this mission, the player gets in close contact with a new gang which prides themselves on their physical strength.
Camera and corridor. Avoid it.
It even work? Said this place was abandoned years ago.
Now it is not. Animals fix their eyes.
Wait, who was that?
Who you think? The runner we won't try to invade you. With the extra eyes we give you,
Look,
it
you
is
can
fine for
always
now.
land one like this.
So, he
Don't
knows
work
I'm
with the
here.
new ones, though. This one's got a motion sensor. Only reacts when you move. New models got muscle memory sims. React to your intention, not your move. Meaning what?
Okay.
The new ones know what I'm gonna do before I
Following the generic path,
This one I
me and my intimidatingly skilled colleague Danish Makiewicz made sure that you'd see a lot of custom chatter to give a background to this new gang. It's quite the cool experience actually, which even features some custom interactions such as this one. Here you can also see how we somewhat abandoned the one path per playstyle approach. If you're a netrunner, you don't just want to follow a trail of breadcrumbs with utility for you, but mess around with devices no matter which path you pick, and same goes for other playstyles.
moves and reasons. June, come on. We'll give you that bullshit.
Ours is a wolf, obviously. Just look at it.
Ultimately, we just decided to give people as many cool options as we could fit on the level. And that worked reasonably well and was also simpler to design for.
This is stupid. I'm just stupid, right? Huh? Weird. The main ATM. Look for the camionette.
Okay, and we're in the big main hall of this location. Now, let's see what happens if the player makes use of their invested skills to unlock another passage.
This is the ATM Central. Stay hidden. Beware of patrol.
Yep, and that's the exit of the gym that we just left. And it's incredible and highlights how sometimes the cost of enhancing the value of invested skills for the player could be quite low. Imagine if we had chosen to do it the other way around and treat this side passage as the generic path, with the gym being unlocked by skill check. That way your skill check would have unlocked an awesome new section for you, rewarding you with a cool and unique experience. To summarize our issues then, first, our plan to use the generic path as fallback turned into a bit of a trap on execution, resulting in it often being the most obvious solution which players would pick. Only too happily, that is. Secondly, oftentimes we would add reward to the challenge generic should provide by also making it the path with a cool, bespoke experience. To fulfill our goal to present a great story, we tended to cluster all our cool content related to exposition, lore, cool encounters, secrets, and sometimes even loot at bottlenecks in the level, like in the end. That in by itself is not such a big problem actually, if you only want to create a cool cinematic narrative experience. However, looking at it from the perspective of creating memorable, non-linear experiences in gameplay, it's hard to give real value to playstyles with this approach. Revisiting our initial approach then, we find that the generic path as fallback is actually one of the main contributors of devaluing our paths, because on execution, it ended up diluting the experience by overemphasizing streamlining to a fault. As for the difficulty of the generic and playstyle paths, our approach resulted in a multitude of skill checks being used to simply bypass encounters, which in hindsight sounds relatively insane. Players invest their hard-earned attribute and perk points, and as a reward, they get to experience less of the game. Well, at least now you guys know where we were coming from. Equipped with the knowledge of what went wrong, I went back and took a look at many of our own levels and wondered how we can marry our cinematic storytelling while still providing varied, non-linear experiences in our level. Truthfully, the outcome of our work wasn't bad. On the aspect of providing the player rich, non-linear experiences, it was merely weaker than we had intended. Based off my comparison between our levels and other games, I decided to expand on some concepts of what we already knew about nonlinear level design to also define how we set up the action and reward structure in our levels. And I call the resulting concept discovery and exploration. Discovery and exploration is a method to structure your level, which expands the concept of analysis, a beat in which the player observes and formulates their plan, and execution, the beat in which the player executes their plan. The concept focuses on setting up choices and providing payoff to give players a more special experience on each path they pick. And like the concept it is based on, it consists of two distinct alternating beats, each with their own characteristics and purpose. This method focuses on beats as part of the reward structure of a level, meaning that individual beats can and should very much still be flavored. Is it a more combat-heavy or the opposite? Does it include environmental puzzles, secrets, story exposition, etc.? Let's take a closer look at the individual beats, starting with the discovery one. This beat is primarily about the player discovering their options, making their choices and overcoming challenges. Not always, but often, this is where you will use your informative overwatch, so not much revolution here. However, from a narrative function perspective, this is the establishing shot of your location. It is here that we set the mood and give the player what they need to know. It's also where we plant some seeds to tease what players may find in later parts of the level. However, it's important to not overspend your budget here, so it's crucial to not shoot all of your powder and save some for later. Once the player made their choice and successfully passed through the discovery area, they now find themselves in our exploration beat. And the exploration beat provides a more intimate and linear experience compared to discovery. It does this by narrowing down the level and what the player can see of the rest of the location, restricting them to the path they have chosen. The intent is to let the player focus on exploring and experiencing the choice they committed to. And this beat is less about making new choices and much more about the consequence of choosing. It's the payoff for having chosen. Now, this is the moment for some cool, intimate experiences. World building, puzzles, special encounters, secrets, expanding on the context of the level's narrative, whatever you can think of to make this cool. As a result, we get two beats which complement each other. Discovery is all about providing choices and presenting the player with promises of the awesome that they're about to uncover. Exploration is where that awesome lives. It's the player experiencing the consequences of their choice of picking a path, and for doing so, exploration rewards the player. It's not only great from the player's perspective, but also from ours as storytellers. This structure allows us to still expose the player to important narrative elements and cinematic moments, while giving the individual player a more unique experience. Used well, the exploration beat can provide more context for our narrative and build on it and thus enhance it. Nonetheless, this concept works best the more okay one is with the player potentially missing cool stuff. Due to my research, I do genuinely think it is okay for players to miss cool things if they do it, and only if they do it by experiencing other cool stuff, basically keeping the net gain for the player in balance. Let's look at how that concept might look like applied to our level, the Braindance Studio. We see that the foundation of analysis and execution are there, classic level design setup. One beat to analyze your path from a vantage point, another to get close to the action and execute your plan. When we rethink it with the concept of discovery and exploration, the beat setup changes to focus on providing choices and promising rewards, then granting them. We still apply the same theory of analysis and execution in discovery, but our focus changes. From this perspective, there's actually room for improvement, mainly in the payoff the exploration beat provides. More on that in a minute. Please try to make a mental note here. I mentioned earlier that as part of my mission, I wanted to find a set of useful principles to help make different paths feel more special. And I did. In addition to discovery and exploration, these principles are widely applicable, even on smaller levels, and through specific actions, a level designer might use these to improve on their designs. Our first of three principles I want to share with you focuses on the proximity of different paths in a level to each other. Take a look at these two entrances, if you can see them. This is a bit of an extreme example, but even though the player has a choice here, does it really feel like a choice worth making? The proximity of these two entrances leaves little room for mystery as to whether these paths are actually any different. Remember the Brainland Studio from earlier and how I mentioned the exploration beat needing improvement? Well, here we're actually looking at it. White represents the intended generic paths, and green are the playstyle paths. What happens is that even when we apply vertical distance to a path, as long as the paths are close to each other, they're still perceived as the same path because the proximity results in them running vertically parallel to each other. And in part to this, the exploration beat fails to provide meaningful rewards by making each choice result in a very similar payoff. So, principle number 1 then, the perception of distance. This principle tries to give the players the perception that they have a choice to make. Which path do I pick? The closer paths are to each other, the less it feels like picking one actually makes a difference. And while verticality can be a valid way of creating distances for entrances, the same cannot be said about the paths themselves. It's important that your paths are perceived by players as being distanced to each other to enhance the feeling of them being different and leading to different outcomes. On the extreme end, this is why having completely different paths through a location is so cool, but potentially very expensive. So, what can we as level designers do to enhance a player's perception of distance between paths and entrances? Well, generally, try to design entrances and paths as far away from each other as reasonably possible. Kind of makes sense. However, it's not so much about the actual distance between the paths as much as it is about the perceived distance. That means anything that can help make paths feel distant from each other, like building a layout in which visibility is limited, setting up encounters or skill checks to make access to the paths more difficult, can also help. Generally, I recommend a quality over quantity approach, especially in smaller locations where it may be hard to properly distance many paths from each other. Rather have 2 that have a high perception of distance, than 3 which are too close to each other. In the setup here, you can see a typical example of a playstyle entrance allowing for a separate access to a location. This in by itself is fine, but if we look at the flow of the paths, we can see that the way the location is built, the initial question of, I wonder where that other path may go, is revealed to the player without them ever actually having to use that path. It exposes that in the end, the path they pick really did not matter all that much. So while principle number 1 tries to build choice, principle number 2 focuses on building and, more importantly, maintaining an air of mystery around the choices. Through principle number 1, the player becomes aware that they need to make a choice. Principle number 2, a perception of exclusivity, prevents them from knowing the alternative outcome and heightens a sense of wonder. The more exclusive and isolated a path feels, the more special it can become in the player's mind. Without a perception of exclusivity, we destroy all chances of players to even wonder whether another path might result in a different outcome. Through perception of exclusivity, we can also allow a player to fully focus on the experience provided from the path they picked, and this in turn heightens a player's curiosity about the possible alternative outcomes they could have experienced. As a level designer, how do I make my paths feel more exclusive, especially if I'm on a tight budget? One of the most cost-effective ways I found to increase a perception of exclusivity for players is to limit and control what a player can see. That means breaking line of sight of the player to alternative paths and entrances to prevent them from figuring out how they work without ever having to use them. Furthermore, to fully allow the player to focus on the path, commit them to a choice by using one-way drops and passages. However, if your game is all about providing freedom like ours, with little notion of punishing the player, allow them to switch between paths, but only at a cost. For example, by making them decide whether they rather stay on the path they picked or try to sneak past a particularly deadly enemy. All right, principle number 3, I think, is the easiest to understand, but maybe not such an easy one to commit to.
For your own safety, please maintain silence.
All right, guys, don't judge. In 2077, even robots need some love. Hope you can see that. This landed well. But onwards we march. All right. All right, our last principle for today focuses on validating the choices the player made, or rather the choice the player made. A perception of uniqueness fulfills the player's desire to have made the right choice while at the same time heightening the stakes and the excitement of making one. And for that to work, we need to treat our paths as special and plan proper payoff for players and be okay with other players potentially missing out. This is what creates value in the choices players make. A choice is not interesting without a proper consequence, or in this case, payoff. This goes for narrative choices as much as for ones done in gameplay, like how we navigate through a level. The player did their part. They made the choice. And now it's on us as designers to make it worth their time and give them a show. Providing a perception of uniqueness is of course done by making sure we allocate budget and find affordable solutions to give the players exclusive content. And this is really where the individual designers and small teams can shine. And I'm sure many of you have experienced at least one instance where someone kit-bashed a cool experience out of seemingly nothing. At CDPR, we have so many incredible minds, especially amongst our quest and open world designers, who excel at this. One of those guys is actually Pavel Sasko over there, our quest director. Thanks to him and some others, we can have Nibbles and Iguana as a pet in the game. Side note, my friend Pavel will be holding a talk tomorrow that you should definitely check out. In it, he also outlines how we design impactful narrative choices for players. All right, getting back to providing cool experiences. We even created a whole type of content in Cyberpunk 2077 we lovingly call mini world stories that gives individual designers the room to mess around and increase the perception of uniqueness while at the same time breathing more life into our world, like the dancing robots or the car bomb encounter for those of you who know it. As for level designers, in addition to providing cool, unique set pieces and visual storytelling, perhaps a cool custom encounter, we can also build our locations in a way that we prevent bottlenecks ending in the same room. Seeing the exit of another path may remind that it is there and make you wonder, but it also ultimately tells you that in the end, all paths lead to Rome. There's more gain in masking this and hiding away those entrances to instead keep the player wondering after the fact, wait, there used to be another path. I wonder where that went. As you can see, much like discovery and exploration, these principles complement and build on each other. Theory is good, however, but often it can be hard to imagine how it translates into practical use cases. I mentioned at the beginning I wanted to apply these principles to validate them, so let's do that. This is a top-down shot from an experimental blockout I created for research purposes. It was created before I started out on my research and development project, and you can tell. White paths are the generic playstyles. In the middle we have the combat one, and above in the north we have the stealth one. Green paths are playstyles. The numbers are entrances to the level, and the letters are exits or goals leading to a lower floor. Just as before, blue zones are discovery beats, and orange ones exploration, though, admittedly, I did not think about them like that at the time of the making of that blockout. And again, all the symptoms are here. There's very low payoff for playstyle paths. Principle number 1, perception of distance, is violated with the playstyle up above, compared to the generic stealth path. We also violate principle number 2, perception of exclusivity. Starting at entrance number 2, players will inevitably see where entrance number 1, basically if they hadn't used their skill check, would have started. Now, equipped with what I had learned, I set out to apply the beats and principles. The second iteration of this blockout sees a small section added to the bottom right corner one and additional passages down to the lower floor. But let's get through this step by step. First, the beat breakdown. You can see now the distribution between discovery and exploration is quite a bit more even, and we have room to provide meaningful rewards. I added additional ways for the players down to the lower floor with no direct line of sight to each other, even leading up to the passages themselves. At the time the player reaches any of the passages, A, B, or C, they will have been locked into their more linear exploration beat for quite a while, increasing the perception of exclusivity. In adding the new section, I tried to enhance the perception of distance of the choices the player has in the discovery beat by moving the entrances to the exploration beats as far from each other as possible. I also changed the setup of the paths with the generic path now leading straight through the middle of the section. At almost no additional cost, I turned the path going from 1 to B into a playstyle exclusive, while also providing a playstyle exclusive branch to enter lower floor access C of the generic stealth path going from 2 to A. The new section actually looks bigger than it is here. It's effectively 1 room and 2 corridors, plus the branch, so again, relatively low cost. Now, let's bring some nuance into this, since I had this discussion with some of my fellow level designers after getting feedback from them. While it's important to make sure vision doesn't give away how paths work, we can and should still carefully and consciously work with it to help the player, of course, build a mental map and navigate the space better. In each exploration beat, the player is able to take a peek at the room in the center of this location, which features a characteristic landmark to help the player understand a bit how they're moving around the location on the path they've picked. You also have an opportunity to do this when using the hidden passage C. The vision here provided, however, does not give away how the alternate paths may work. Finally, let's take a look at the lower floor to see how the passages enter into that space. Here, the letters are simply the continuation of the exits on the floor above. Notice how none of the paths end in the bottleneck that is the discovery zone here. From none of the entrances into the area can you actually see any of the other options the player could have taken. Now, these were the beats and applying principle number 1 and principle number 2. What about principle number 3, the perception of uniqueness? Well, with the new section added and the northernmost path being turned into a playstyle path, I now had the room to enhance the perception of uniqueness. And let's take a brief tour across the level to see how the location itself tries to give the player unique experiences and zones to explore, starting with the generic stealth path with the playstyle exclusive branch, so entrance 2 to exit C. As the player enters this level, they find themselves in this space over here. And stealthing past the enemies through the door on the right, they enter this new room that I added in the second iteration. Now it's hard to see here, especially I suppose in this situation, but there's a hidden passage here that techies can unlock to reach a hidden underground passage. And finding that and going through that puts you into this situation here, a unique little set piece which only those players would be able to find that gives more information about the background of what this space could be. And now, let's take a look at the other playstyle exclusive path in comparison. So, path 1 to exit B. As those players enter the location, they find themselves in this area over here, where they actually have the option to look into the room that the other path just stealthed through. Moving through a door on the left, they find themselves in the big room with the landmark I mentioned earlier. And successfully stealthing through this section on the left side, they find themselves in this room where in the background there's also a small little window that again looks back into the landmark room. And stealthing through this, you can make your way down to the lower floor where you see this section. And as you can see, the paths provide completely different experiences, each giving their own little slice and impression on the player. What's going on here? All right, let's summarize. I equip you guys with 3 principles to enhance your nonlinear designs. Principle number 1, distance builds choices. And you can enhance it by making sure to spread entrances and paths as far away from each other as possible. Principle number 2, exclusivity, heightens wonder, which you can enhance by limiting the player's vision on other paths and committing the player to their choice using one-way passages. Principle number 3, fulfills desire, which you can enhance by reserving and providing cool content for players and by avoiding to shatter the illusion for paths leading to the same outcome by not having them bottleneck into the same room. All 3 of these principles are not restricted to, but particularly effective at enhancing the powers of 2 different level beats designed to maximize choice and reward. That is, discovery and exploration. As always in our design-related disciplines, however, nothing is always 100% true, and all of these concepts heavily depend on the context of your game. Hopefully, this is still useful food for thought for you. With my research done and principles tested, I see my quest is updated, and I'm happy to say that the XP I gained provided a worthy payoff. Great quest, would play again. And now, you know about the benefits of missing out. I put a lot of heart and effort into bringing you this, and I hope you found this valuable and fun. From the bottom of my heart, I want to say thank you for joining me here today. Doing a thing like this isn't easy. It's a lot of work, and there's a lot of imposter syndrome going on when you try to do this. However, there's my contacts. Please feel free to reach out to me. Also, a big shout out to Blake for getting me into this and coaching me. Thank you so much. You're awesome. And thank you to GDC and the Level Design Summit team for inviting me. I'll be over at the wrap-up area in a moment, ready to answer your questions. And yeah, see you there. Thank you. Also, if you enjoyed this talk, please go check out the ones that my amazing colleagues are about to give. I'm sure you'll find them insightful as well. We're here all week, guys.